Professor Robert Danisch, I would like to start this interview with a question about the 2020 US election. That election was one of the most important elections during the US history, and we saw a huge impact of AI in social media during the US campaigns, especially if you consider the Trump campaign. And now we are seeing a massive impact of this AI on communication. The way we communicate, it is not the same if we compare to the previous century with the television, newspapers, and radio. Now, it looks like the fake news is becoming even more threatening, especially on the political contests. Considering what we saw during the 2020 elections, US campaign and election, what do you think should be done to reduce the risks of unethical communication, especially unethical communication made by authoritarian governments like Donald Trump rhetoric? What do you think should be done to reduce those risks?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really, really good and important question that you're asking. To answer, I first want to start with a distinction that I find helpful for thinking about this problem. And that's a distinction between what I might label communications with an S and communication without an S. And I think one of the great transformations of my lifetime has been the invention of systems of communications with an S. So when I use the word communications with an S, I mean technical systems of information moving across distances. And obviously social media is one of the key kind of ways in which communications technologies have revolutionized the way we interact with one another. But communication without an S is the thing that I call the human problem of making meaning. So it's not just about information transmission, it's about how we make meaning in the world together. And what we saw with Trump's authoritarian rhetoric is not at all new as a human communication problem. In fact, he used techniques like ad populum and ad baculum, which are ad populum is an appeal to the crowd, and baculum is a threat or a form of intimidation, which are really, really typical of fascist and nationalist leaders all over the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. What's new is the systems of communication that allowed for the transmission and movement of that information, and the ways in which those systems of transmission mediate our lives together with one another. So historically, in previous democracies, our ability to kind of engage in the human process of making meaning together was unmediated by these technical systems of transmission. And now it's not. So our shared human problem of making meaning together is fully mediated by these huge and complicated systems of transmission. So it wasn't Trump's rhetorical practices that were new. It was the ways in which our systems of communication accelerated and amplified those rhetorical tactics in ways we haven't really seen as a human civilization before, I don't think. So I think the key lies less in regulating Trump's specific rhetorical practices in his speeches, or any authoritarian specific rhetorical practices in his or her speeches, but in managing or creating and regulating the systems of transmission that mediate our lives.
So, okay, in your article, Political Rhetoric in a World Risk Society, you say, much political debate over the last 20 years has centered on the decline in the power and legitimacy of government and the need to renew the culture of democracy. So, based on the effect of technologies, do you believe that democracy will survive?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult question. So I think that that question turns on whether we believe and what we believe democracy is, for starters. So over the course of my lifetime, the right in the United States has explicitly made an object of criticism democratic institutions of governance. So from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, there has been a disbelief and a discrediting of those institutions of governance. But democracy isn't just the institutions of governance that we have. For me, democracy is a combination of those institutions of governance and habits of everyday life. So I believe, like John Dewey, the American philosopher, that democracy is a way of life and not just a system of government. And when we call democracy a way of life, I think what we mean is that it's a way of trying to figure out how to live well with others who are different from us, and trying to solve problems cooperatively and collaboratively, regardless of difference. And I think that the right in the US, at least, has made the systems of government a target of their critiques. And in so doing, they've also undermined our ability to live democracy as a way of life. And I think that one of the sad things about social media and those systems of communication that I was just talking about is, in many ways, the systems are also undermining democracy as a way of life. So the critique of democratic governance doesn't just come from authoritarians like Trump, it also or Reagan. It also comes from Silicon Valley itself. It comes from the people that are designing these technologies and deploying them in the world. They don't trust government either. They think their solutions are better than government solutions, and that the free market can can do all the regulating of life that it needs to do. But actually what we're seeing is that technologies or media companies like Facebook are disintegrating the social component of democracy as a way of life, just like Trump and all are attacking or critiquing or disintegrating the institutions of governance. So the real worry, I think, is the combined dissolution of the effectiveness of those institutions of governance and the kind of crumbling of the social fabric that is required of effective democratic living. So Facebook to the extent that it contributes to polarization and radicalization, it undermines people's ability to live well with difference, to cooperate with others who are different from us in order to solve collective action problems. And that is very tragic and very dangerous. So I think that we're at a moment where democracy is more under threat than it's ever been, because of the combination of the way that technology undermines democracy as a way of life and the ongoing rights criticism and attempt to delegitimize the institutions of law and decision-making that are hallmarks of democratic governance. So those two kind of combined leave me very, very sanguine about the future of democracy. I think in order to rehabilitate democracy, especially in the US, which is, I think, on the brink of civil war, in order to rehabilitate democracy, you have to do both things. You have to rehabilitate the institutions of governance, but you also have to rehabilitate the social structure. You have to figure out how to get ways for people to cooperate together. And the only way we're going to rehabilitate the social structure is if we figure out how to manage technology companies in a way that they don't contribute to the kind of polarization and resentment and anger and violence that we're seeing in the US.
So researchers like Hubert Nublo, they say that communication is a way to shape realities. When we consider a lot of fake contents, like fake news, deepfake, they are spreadable on social media. Which kind of reality technology is creating or distorting, and what happens if we don't stop it?
Yeah, so this question reminds me of Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion. In Lippmann's, which was written in the 1920s, and there was a similar fear at that time in the 1920s, as I think we have now, around this question of fake news or deep fakes, et cetera. They didn't use the term fake news, but what Lippmann argued was that there are what he called pictures in our head, and then there's the real world out there. And his contention was that the world was so complex and so intricate and so far away from so many of us that it was impossible for any one of us to have an accurate picture in our head of what the world was really like. And initial mass communication technology like radio, like film, like TV, sort of created a problem whereby the picture in our head could be like a deep distortion of what reality was out there. And normal people had no choice but to rely on those pictures in our heads because we couldn't get at reality. So I think it's true that communication is always shaping reality. It's always already been shaping reality for as long as we've been humans. I think the difference for us now is the speed and scale with which artificial intelligence, social media, all these technologies can create false representations of the world and then circulate those false representations of the world with tremendous speed. Lippmann's recommendation is actually not far from my own recommendation. Lippmann thought about the necessity of essentially government regulators or institutions of expertise that would mediate or sort through some of the fakes or some of the deeply false representations. And right now you see this in like Facebook's content moderators. They're kind of a joke. Like the content moderators on Facebook don't really do their jobs. They don't work effectively. And Facebook has such little incentive to actually moderate their own content. But it seems to me that the government will at some point, if it wants to mitigate the kind of rampant spread of this fake content, it has to do something to regulate that spread. So the power of technology is in speed and accuracy of simulation. So that combination can be deadly for a democracy. And it's more complicated, more difficult than Lippmann ever thought about in the 1920s, but it's the same problem, really. Communication's always shaping reality. It's the devastating speed and the accuracy of the simulations that technology can perform and accomplish that's new. But the regulation of that kind of fakery still falls on governments to make happen. And if they don't, then you're going to see what we're seeing in the United States. We're going to see 70% of people who believe the election was rigged when it wasn't.
Social media algorithms, they are polarizing nations, not only in US but around the world. We are seeing a lot of polarization. This is a type of reality that was created by the interference of a technology in the 21st century. And do you believe that it's possible to solve this problem, and how? And do you see any success case from any country?
I'm not sure I see governments solving this problem yet. I do see examples of the use of technology that can avoid the kind of polarization and conflict that we see in such a crystal clear fashion in the US. I'm thinking of, there's a Reddit site called Change My View, or it might be Change My Mind or Change My View. And that site's like a fascinating example of a location that is truly democratic to me, because people have to engage with the Reddit, the subthread, in ways that align with the values and the rules that are managed by the thread. And then what happens inside that space is that people do change their minds. It actually works. So once you regulate the space in such a way that for example, Trump's authoritarian rhetorical tactics of ad baculum, threats of force, or reification, which is treating other people like objects, or ad hominem attacks, once they're forbidden from use on the site and people can't do that with one another, and they have to actually engage one another in different communicative fashion, then it turns out you are able to change other people's minds. Um, so I don't think that, I guess I should put it like this. There's nothing inherent in the technology themselves, in whatever digital technology, that produces polarization. The kind of polarization and the conflict that's in the US right now is not a natural outcome of the use of digital technology or the use of social media. It's an outcome based on the ways in which we've decided it's acceptable to use social media and the ways in which people are encouraged to use digital technology. So we have in communication studies, at least for me, I talk about communication systems and communication practices, and they're related, they're always connected. So some communication systems encourage specific communication practices. Facebook's design and organization as a system encourages the kind of polarization that's an outcome. But it doesn't have to. It's not natural, or it's not given that that would happen. I think we need to figure out how to use digital technology to design systems that encourage the kind of thing that's happening on that Reddit subthread, change my view, and not the kind of thing that happens through kind of Facebook's like, thumbs up, thumbs down, or those like buttons on Facebook. I think we can do that, and it would open up new possibilities for what technology can do to rehabilitate democracy if we did that.
Hey, Professor Robert Danisch, thank you very much for participating of this interview.
Thanks for having me.